Welcome back. Now it's time to create external table. In this session, we are going to create our first external table. We'll start with creating the external table for the taxi zone file, which is in CSV format. Let's take a look at the database objects that are required for this. We're going to create a new database for our logical database, and we'll call that as NYC Taxi LDW. I call the LDW to mean that it is a logical data warehouse. We want to create the tables in specific schemas with meaningful names. We're going to use the industry standard of bronze, silver, and gold to mean raw, cleansed, and curated respectively, as we saw in the previous session. We need the external data source, and we're going to call that as NYC Taxi SRC. Also, we need the external file format to hold the information about our taxi zone file, which is in CSV format. With a header, we'll create a file format called the CSV file format, which could be used for other CSV files too. Finally, we need to create the external table in the bronze schema using the external data source and the file format that we've created. So these are the objects we need to create in order to create the external table. Let's switch over to Synapse Studio and get started. Here we are in our Synapse Studio. Now that we are done with our discovery and we are going to create the logical data warehouse to virtualize our data, let's create a new subfolder and call that as LDW to make it more meaningful. And this is the folder in which I'm going to create all the scripts that are required to build a logical data warehouse. The first thing we want to do is to create our LDW database in order to create a user database such as the LDW1 that we are going to create. We need to be using the master database. As you can see here from the drop-down, we are already using the master database, but it is a recommended practice to use that within your script so that you are 100% sure that you're using the master database. So doing that is the first thing. And the second statement I'm going to use is the create database statement to create the database that we need, and we wanted to call our database as NYC_taxi_LDW, and the next thing we want to do is to alter this database to use the UTF collection. If you remember from the earlier lessons, because we've got strings within our CSV and the Parquet files, we need to be using the UTF-8 collation. So this page here tells you which collation is recommended. So the recommended one here is the Latin 1, generally 1 general 100 bin 2 UTF-8. So that's the one we are going to use. So let me switch back to the script and I'll just type in the command for that. So with that, we've created our database. The next thing we want to do is to create the schema. So for this lesson, we just need the bronze schema. But as you know, we want to create the bronze, silver, and gold for our project. So I'm going to create all three of them here while we're doing this. So in order to create this schema, you need to switch to the database in which the schema is going to be created, which is our LDW database. So let's do that. I'm going to use NYC Taxi LDW, and then I'm going to create the schema. So let's create the schemas one by one. So this is going to be bronze, the first one. And then we'll create the other two as well. So that's everything we wanted to have in this SQL script. But before I execute that, if you're new to Microsoft SQL Server or Synapse, you might be wondering why I'm using Go instead of semicolon in the script. That's because some of the statements here, for example, the create schema has to be on its own transaction. So Go gives us the ability to make the statements between the two statements are from the beginning and the Go is one single transaction. So not every statement together here makes one transaction. Each one is a transaction on its own right. So that's why I've done that. But let's now execute this. I'm going to click Run. And the query executed successfully, and we should have the database now. So as you can see, because we switched to the LDW database, so we've seen the LDW database as well, and the schema is created in them as well. Let's give a meaningful name to this script. I'm going to call this one_create_databases. The next thing we want to do is to create the external data source. I'm going to create a new SQL source stat and keep that separate. And the first statement I'm going to do is to switch to the database in which we are going to create the external data source, which is our LDW database. And let me show you the syntax for creating the external data source. And as you can see here, this is the syntax, but this is with the type Hadoop. And as you can see, that is only available in dedicated SQL pools, and we want to create the native one. So let me copy this, and then I'll make the corresponding changes. And so it starts with to create a clear external data source, and we want a name for the data source. And as we said, we were going to call that as nyc_taxi_src, and now we need to specify the location. So the location here is the URL. So let me show you how to get that. You can go to the Data Hub here, and then underneath the linked section, not the workspace, the link section, you will see your storage account, and then you can see the container, and we want the container to be our URL for that. So in order to get the URL, you go to the container and click on the three dots there, and then click on Properties, and then you can copy the URL. So I'm going to copy the URL, and let me close this, and I'm in the script here, and I'm going to copy the URL here. So that is our HTTPS protocol. You could use the ABFSS protocol if you wanted to, but this is the default one the tools seem to give. And we want to have the container as our data source. So you'll be able to access everything within the container using this data source. And as I said before, we already have access to this storage account from the Synapse Studio using the Active Directory pass-through authentication. So we don't need that here in our case. And let me put the semicolon as well in here, and that is our data source. So let me click Run, and that should execute and create the data source for me. So that successfully created the data source. And let's switch to the Workspace tab here. Within our Data Hub and within our SQL database, we should be able to see our new database and the external data source. So I'm not seeing anything here. That's because I haven't refreshed. So let me click here and refresh, and I should see the new database. And as you can see, that's the new database. And within your external resources, you will be able to see the external data source as well. So that's what we've created, which is the NYC Taxi SRC. So let me rename the script, and I'm going to call this as to_create external data sources. So the next thing we want to do is to create the external file format. Again, I'm going to create a new script and keep that separate. So that's going to contain all the file formats I'm going to create for this project. So the first thing, as we did before, is to switch to our database. And let me show you the syntax for creating the external file format. So as you can see in the Microsoft documentation, we got the syntax for create in the external file format here. And this is Parquet, and this is delimited text. So we have got a delimited text in our case. The taxi zone file is a CSV file, as you know. So let me copy the whole lot, and then we can make the corresponding changes. I'm going to just simply put it in here. And as we said before, we are going to call this a CSV file format. I know it's a generic name, but we can use this for any CSV file with any process instead of creating one for each of the files. So the format type is delimited text. Our file we know is not compressed, so we don't have to specify the data compression. So let's remove that, and we want to specify the format options because we have a delimited file with specific formats. If you remember, we got the header row, we've got the field terminator, and all of those kind of things. So I'm going to copy the format options from here and put it into that statement about here. So everything goes within the two brackets here. And we don't need this anymore. So I'm going to just simply remove that, and we'll start making the changes. So the first thing is our field terminator. So field terminator is comma in our case, so let's specify that. And we wanted the string delimiter. As we said, we want to see quoted files. I'm going to use quoted strings here. And the first row here is a number 2. So I'm going to specify 2. That's because, as you know, we've got a header within the file, but we didn't want to use the header information from the file because that wasn't in a consistent format. So I'm going to ignore the header, and we'll specify the header explicitly whenever we come to create the external tables. I'll show you how that's done. And the other thing we want to do is type default. We're going to leave that as false. That's because what the type default does is, if you specify that as true, every column that's got no values within a text file, it'll replace that with the default values. We don't want that. So for example, if you have a null integer value, it'll put zeros. If you have another date, it'll provide a default date. I think that is 1900-0101, as you can see here. And if it's a string column, it'll provide the empty string rather than another value. So we don't want any of those changes. So I'm going to leave that as false. And then the encoding, as you know, ours is that UTF-8 file and the parser version. As we discussed before, we want to use the 2.0 parser version, which is the most efficient one, and we want to remove all the pipes and replace them with commas. Let's run it. It throws error as we need to remove the date format line. So I think that's everything. So let's execute that, and that should create the CSV file format as our external file format. So that's done as well. And I'm going to rename the script to have a meaningful name. So that's going to be called 3_create_external file formats. So we've got everything. We've got the databases, we've got the data sources, and we've got the file formats. So the last thing we want to do is to create the external table. Again, I'm going to create a new script, and I'm going to call this one as 4_create_bronze tables. So what I'm planning to do is to put the create statements for all of the bronze tables in this single script, and it'll contain everything. So again, similar to what we did previously, let's switch to LDW database. And let me show you the syntax for creating the external table. So as you can see here, this is the syntax. So you've got the create external table statement. And within that, you can specify the column definitions here. So that would be the column name and the data type and the collation. In our case, we specified the collation on the database itself, so we don't have to specify any collation here. And we got reject options here. So if you want to have any rejections to be handled, then you'll do that as well. But I'm going to ignore the rejections to start with, and I'll show you how to deal with rejections in the next session. But in this one, we're just going to create the external table. So I'm going to just copy that, and let's put it there, and then I'll make the changes. So the table name, you can qualify that with a schema, a name, and a table name. Or you can do the table name alone. Or the database name, schema name on the table name. In our case, we've already searched to the database, so we are in that database, so we don't need to specify the database name. So let's go for the schema name.table name. So the schema in our case is in bronze, as you know, and the table name is taxi zone. So that's what we're going to call, and we want to specify the column definitions. So the easiest way is to go to the discovery script that we wrote, and we can just copy the schema from there. So as you can see here, I think we should have this schema as the last thing here within the with clause. So let me copy that. And then we can make the corresponding changes. And let me switch over to this script here, and I'm going to copy and just remove the numbers here. And that should give us what we want. Now that we've got the column definitions here, let's specify the others. So let's start with the data source. So we were clear to the data source here, and that is called NYC Taxi SRC. That takes us to the container NYC Taxi data. So let me put that in here. And we want the location within that data source. As you know, it takes us to the container, but we need to navigate to the file within that. So let me switch to the data hub and go to link and show you. So the data source takes us up to here, which is the NYC Taxi data container, but our file is under the folder raw, and the name of the file is called taxi_zone.csv. So we need to specify raw/taxi_zone.csv. So that's what we are going to do. Okay. So we need the external file format name. So let's go to that script and copy that. So we called that a simply CSV_file format. So I'm going to put that in here. And as I said before, the reject options is an optional parameter as well. So I'm going to remove the rejects now, but I'm going to talk you through that in the next session, and let's put the semicolon back here. And if we run that, that should create the table we need. So I'm going to simply run that, and the table is created. So let's go to our data hub within Workspace. We should now see the table bronze.taxi zone. So I'm going to quickly do a refresh. And then within external tables you would see bronze taxi zone, and I should be able to just simply do a select from a table like you would normally do within an RDBMS tables. And that should give me all of the data. So let me just simply run that and I should see all the data. And as you can see, we are seeing all of the data, and you can now use this table to query as if you are in a normal traditional database, and you can connect from things like Power BI via Tableau or anything to do that as well actually. And if you have a data scientist or a data analyst, they don't have to worry about the definitions of the external file formats or the external data sources and all the complexities. And they would simply be able to query the table and get the information they need as quickly as possible. And that's the benefit of having an external table. There's one more thing I want to show you before we finish the lesson. In this case, we created everything by hand, including the data sources and file formats and the table here. But the UI gives you the ability to generate an initial script, and then you make the changes as you wish. Let me show you how to do that. So you can go to your data hub and then click on link and browse to your file. So in our case, it's the taxi zone, and then you can right-click on that and then do a new SQL script and click on create external table, and you provide the information that's required, for example, commas, the field terminator, and the first row. In our case, we selected 2 and we gave our own column names, which doesn't work really well in the UI. So I'm going to just leave that as first row as number 1 and then say in column names and string delimiter is the default, and let's leave these as defaults, and then you need to specify the database. In our case, it's the LDW database, and then we need to provide the table name, which is bronze.taxizone. And you've got 2 options here. You can automatically create the external table. So if you click on that, it'll create the table for you. Or you can get SQL script and make the changes you wanted and then execute the script yourself. So I'm going to just do using SQL script and show you what comes out. So as you can see here, it's creating the file format here, and then it's creating the data source. And it's very similar to what we did in our case. But as you can see, it's used the ABFSS protocol rather than the HTTPS protocol. So you can use them. It's fine, and it's provided the column names and the data types, but the data types, as you can see, are really big. So you can tune them, you can make the changes you want to add, and you can change the name of the external file format and data so as to make it more meaningful for your case as well. And then you can just execute it. If you execute this script under your database, it'll just do everything for you. I didn't want to take you through this first because I wanted you to understand every single line of code that's in there before you go and get something which is already being created for you. I still encourage you to do everything by hand yourself during the course so that you understand each of the statements and the meaning behind each of the parameters and all of those things. Rather than getting the UI to generate the SQL for you, which will be quicker but the learning won't be as good. Let me click discard on this and let me publish the changes so that all the scripts are in the repository. And that's the end of this session. I'll see you in the next one.